How's it going? So I really enjoyed trap shooting clay targets, and my daughter got me into it. She used to be a dancer, but then she changed up her sport of choice and she switched to trap shooting. I really enjoy the sport. I've met a lot of great people through it as well. I really stink at it, but I also came across a new thing that I make just because of trap shooting. So as my daughter Danny got started, she would occasionally get a bruise on her cheek from the shotgun. It's not uncommon. A lot of people get a bruise. Some people even get a sore on their cheek, and it's painful. So one of my friends who owns a gun shop, a great guy, he said, you need to get a soft top comb for your daughter. That'll solve the problem. And he's a great trap shooter and a coach out at the gun club as well. And I asked him some questions, and he said, well, why don't you just make one? He said, you're a wood guy, you make stuff all the time. Well, I thought, what the heck? What do I have to lose? I didn't have a picture of one. I had never seen one. Don't seem to be really any videos on making them. So I kind of set out on a journey. I made a couple. I would take them in, show my friend at the gun shop. He'd say, nope, the foam is too soft, or it doesn't fit quite right, or, you know, a variety of different things. So I kind of felt my way through the whole thing based on his advice. Finally, I got one that worked, and I refined the process a little at a time with his help. And now I've made a bunch of them for people, a variety of different kinds of guns. The one I'm going to show today is a Browning Cynergy, how to make one for a Browning Cynergy. They're a little bit different than a lot of other guns. I've made them for a number of different Berettas with both aftermarket add-on combs and ones that come from the factory. Tri-Stars, a number of those, I think some SKBs. Each of them are a little different, but there's really two different styles that I've run across. Here's the one that got me started. This is still my very first one. This is a Tri-Star that my daughter used to shoot. Now she shoots a Beretta, and Dad inherited her old gun. So it is really just wood on the bottom, some foam on the top, covered with leather. I don't do the leather work. I have a friend do that, so I won't be going into that much. But there's a couple different ways that they attach. I'll talk just a little bit about it, mostly about the Browning version. And if this video gets some love and some comments, maybe I'll do one on some of the other versions in the future. As I mentioned, there's two different styles of mounting for a soft top. One of them is that your soft top, your gun has two posts sticking out of it. And the comb has collars that go over top of it with a set screw, a lot like this. So this seems like maybe a fairly exotic piece, but if you're a guy who likes hardware stores like me, you might recognize that these are called motor shaft collars. You usually find them in the section of the hardware store that has a bunch of pull-out trays. You pay for them individually. The last time I bought these, and I buy quite a few at one time usually, I think they were $1.68 each. So they're not expensive. And I would even consider buying a spare. This whole project, when I do one, my material cost is probably less than $40. That includes having the leather work done. Compare that to $250 and up for having a soft top made. So this is the style that I generally have used on Berettas and Tri-Stars. It seems to be the most common. The other style is a pin. And here I have a comb for a Browning Cynergy. I actually made a soft top for this customer before. It was covered with a reflective silver leather, and it's really pretty neat looking, but they said that it's too reflective and they want something a little bit more flat. They don't get so much light in their eyes. But these posts essentially go down into the gun, and then there's a locking screw down inside the stock. So one of the tricks with either method is finding pieces that work. So with this one, sometimes these collars, you have to get really close, and then you have to drill them out. Pretty handy to have a drill press for that. You don't need something fancy, but you need something to hold it steady. Really handy to have a caliper for that. It allows you to measure really, really accurately. In this case, for the Cynergy, these posts, I was a little nervous. I couldn't remember what I used before. I thought I'd used a bolt. But when I used the caliper to measure them up, turns out they're exactly 3/16 of an inch. So Seems like a pretty common size. Now, a lot of the guns will be using metric size parts as well. You just have to be a little creative with your hardware choices sometimes. So at the hardware store, I found these. They're called, I have a couple here, they're called a 3/16 by 1.5" shank handle rivet. So they are kind of like a screw without any threads, or a nail without any point, and they do measure up to be exactly 3/16 of an inch. They're a tiny bit long, but that's not a problem. So this is my hardware. Now I have to talk about my choice of wood for the base material. So here's a completed soft top for a TriStar trap gun, not the one that I shoot, a little different one, but it's soft on the top. You can tell it's spongy. And down here, it's wood. Okay, you can see the bottom of it, it's lumber. I use plywood. Compared to using solid lumber, plywood is easier to work with. It's dimensionally stable. It doesn't change with heat and humidity very much. It's just a superior product for something like this. In particular, I use a kind of plywood known as Baltic birch. You can see the different layers in it very clearly, and there's a lot more glue in this. A regular piece of plywood, as you cut it open, a lot of times you'll find voids in it. They're small, but they're there. This, all the voids are patched and all the layers are really bonded tightly. This is 1/2 inch. They measure it in millimeters, so it's actually a little bit different. And it comes in a really weird size sheet. It's 60 inches by 60 inches rather than 48 inches by 96 inches, like most sheets of plywood. Now, you certainly don't need that much for this project, and I know even a lot of hobby stores, I think, sell sheets of this in 1 by 1 foot or 2 by 2 foot pieces. You pay more for it per square foot that way, but if you don't have room or need to have a bunch of plywood sitting around forever, that might be a better choice. This is oftentimes scraps from making drawers when I build cabinets. So that's the plywood. And you don't need a big piece. There's not a lot there. And then the foam. The foam is interesting too. So I went through a lot of different things, including cutting up yoga rollers and pool noodles and, geez, packing foam, but it was never quite right. So the one that I ended up with, at the suggestion of my friend Daryl, who owns the gun shop, was energy absorbing mats. These are the ones that people use on gym floors, garage floors, you name it. You can buy them at Lowe's, Home Depot, Menards. I think Walmart carries them. You name it, man. There are bunches of places that carry them, and they're cheap. But that foam is pretty dense, and it's got a nice rebound quality. And we're going to be covering with leather anyway, so if you end up with bright yellow ones, big deal. Okay? So our materials are simple. We need some piece of metal hardware that's going to attach it to the gun, be that a pin or a collar, depending on your system. We need a little bit of Baltic birch plywood, and we need this foam. From there, for tools, we're going to need a drill and possibly a center punch, a pencil, pretty easy stuff, some sort of saw to cut out the shape, and some sanding equipment. I have pretty nice tools because of the hobbies and the small business that I run, but you truly could do this with hand tools. It's all based on patience. Probably the hardest part of this whole thing is getting the holes to line up correctly in your blank or your starting piece. It sounds goofy. How hard can it be? These little pins sticking out to get them spaced right. Well, I tried a lot of things, and actually the Browning is an easier one to work with. I tried measuring with a caliper. That didn't work right. My cousin made me a little jig to measure. That worked better, but that actually works better on this style of top than this one. So what I did for the Cynergies I've done in the past is I just take them on the board I'm going to use, and this one's a little bit small. I'm not going to use it, just an example. I just push them down. Get some good indentations in it. And you can't see them on the camera, but there's dents there. So I would know where to drill. From there, I would grab a center punch, punch them, and then I've got a center to drill my hole. There's nothing special about the hole that I drill. I just use a 3/16 drill bit, just like the size of the pin, and I drill them with a hand drill. I have a drill press. I have a nice drill press. I just never seem to use it. I try to do as many checks as I can on my way through the process, and the way that I do it is like this. I've drilled the holes. Now I can just slide this in and see how it lines up. Oops, that one doesn't line up. Neither does this one quite right. Almost, but you need it to be an easy fit, okay? So yeah, even though I've made probably 30 soft tops, it took me 3 tries. And I swear when I first started this, it took me less tries. So I slide this in, and then you can see I made a pencil mark around the outside. Of course, that's going to be kind of my blank size. That's going to be my starting point. If I slip this back out, it comes out kind of tough, which is good. That's the way I want it. I want it to be a firm fit for these pins. You can also see that the pins that I bought slide right in. So, next step is thinking about how we're going to get the pins to stay in here. I've used a bunch of different methods. The one that I prefer involves epoxy. So I've got my blank and I've got my pin, but I need to drill a little bit of a countersink in there so that this head will sit flat. It doesn't need to be very deep, and you could do this with really any kind of drill bit you want that's large enough. I'm using a Forstner bit. They drill a flat bottom hole. Let's see how this goes. It's going to wander like crazy. Doesn't need to be very deep, just deep enough to conceal the head on this. I'm going to go a little bit deeper. So I can get some extra epoxy in there. Let me try it out. Yep, fits down in there about twice the depth of the head. I'm going to use my bandsaw to cut this up. So like I said, I've got plenty of tools. And if you don't have a bandsaw, you can use a coping saw. You can buy those really cheap. You can use a handsaw and just keep trimming the edges until they get as round as you can. I get pretty close to the line, but I usually rely on a lot of sanding to get all the way up to the line. I don't know why I don't trust my bandsaw skills, but I just never do. You can, you'll eventually need to be inside the line, actually when we're done sanding, to make up thickness for the leather. But do what's comfortable for you. And if you don't have a bandsaw, like I said, there's a lot of other options. It's a very common tool, so you might have a friend that has one too. So here's the tool I use for most of my shaping. It's a combination 4-inch belt sander and a 6-inch disc sander. This is a nice tool to have. It's not absolutely a necessity. You can use anything from a vibrating palm sander to sandpaper or files. All of it works, and they all have their time and place. This was a super good deal for me because my dad gave it to me. He has several of these from making custom knives, and anytime I say I want to get something, he seems to give me one or buy one for me. Not all a bad deal. But I just shape it on its edges like this. I keep watching this line, Now with this style, we're really lucky because we can continually slip this in and get a feel for if the shape is right. Notice that the nose is different here. We'll work on that towards the end. And we'll also, once we get down towards the end, I will put the foam on top. And we'll see how that works. Pretty close, but it's still hanging a little bit off this edge. Let's take my pencil, run along the edge. This part's a little bit tricky, but I need to come up with transferring these edges to my blank. And initially you might think I'll slide this in and then mark them straight down. Well, that would make this piece quite a bit shorter than it should be. So instead, I try to line them up side to side, okay? Get the holes pretty well lined up like this. Maybe not the easiest thing to see, and then I'll mark it, okay? Now, This doesn't have to be precision work. As one of my friends always used to say, we're not building a liquor store. It's kind of a funny saying, but it's a good one. There can be a little fudge room on either end. Got my foam all ready to go on, actually smooth side down. When we take a look at it, we can see that a single layer of foam is going to be enough to make up the difference. So that's good, that's nice. Sometimes you can do 2 layers of foam. I was going to put it on, and it actually occurred to me when I was looking for my double-sided tape that I couldn't find, that I first need to glue my pins in. So, simple process, works the same no matter which style of soft top I'm making. I use epoxy, and I generally use the 5-minute stuff. Loctite's the brand that I'm using. There's quite a few out there. I've used epoxy to make river style tables and live edge furniture, so there's a lot of kinds out there, ranging from West Systems on the high end to no-name brands on the low end. We don't need a ton of strength for this, and 5-minute epoxy honestly has plenty of strength. You just have to be a little patient with it. It might say that it sets up in 5 minutes, but honestly I don't work on it and sand it until the next day if I can help it. I'm not always the most patient guy, sometimes it's a few hours later. Got to make sure that we mix it really well. I think that's one of my things about epoxy that I learned over time, is that the secret isn't getting them combined completely. I think a lot of people with these quick set epoxies think that when you see them turning white, they're mixed completely. They're not. That's just air bubbles being introduced into it. So I'm going to start off by sort of filling these voids, and they're going to pick up, as I make the shaft of the rivet pick up epoxy as it slides through, which will need some cleaning up on the other end. Okay, here we go. Start that one. A little bit on the bottom I can wipe off. Start this one. That off. I should pull it through from this side with the hopes that I don't make quite as big of a mess on my fingers. If you've worked with epoxy, you know that it doesn't really come off your skin very well. A little frustrating. I'm going to attempt to overfill these holes. Epoxy tends to shrink as it dries, and I'll be sanding this top smooth and flat anyway on the belt sander. And if you don't have a belt sander, another option to use, I use it a lot, is just gluing this piece of sandpaper to like a piece of plywood. And then you can run the board back and forth. It's amazing how fast it cuts, so don't be afraid to try that. Alright. And this will be off camera, but I'm just going to clamp this to the edge of my workbench so it sits really nice. These are nice and straight down. I like these little globs of epoxy off with my fingers, unfortunately. And then it'll have plenty of time to dry. I gave this piece a day to dry. Now the epoxy is nice and solid. Don't try to outrun the epoxy. By that I mean make sure you give it plenty of drying time. It's nice and solid now. Otherwise, when you go to sand it, it'll get kind of gooey underneath. So there's just little bumps. They're smooth, but there's a little bit. I'm going to run it across the belt sander a tiny bit to smooth it down, and then we're going to add the foam. This isn't super smooth, but it's smooth enough. To attach our foam to our wooden blank, I'm going to use double stick tape. This isn't any old double stick tape. This is carpet tape, and it is a favorite of mine. The adhesive is super strong. It's fairly forgiving that it'll cover a slightly rough surface. I've never had problems with the foam pulling off, and when you think about it, there's really no pressure or tension against it. I've thought about using CA glue or super glue. Sometimes that's kind of hard on plastics though, at least when I use activator it is. I think you could use a bunch of different methods, but this is one that I've had really good luck with. So I'm going to start by putting a layer top of the wood. And just take my utility knife and cut off what I don't need. This can be some kind of tough stuff as well, which isn't all bad. Now, I'm going to cut around it with my knife to get rid of that excess. One thing about this tape is it can kind of clog up your sandpaper. So it's nice to take off any excess before you start working it. And of course, before you peel the backing off what is now the top side, because otherwise it's going to stick itself down. If you're a woodworker at all, I highly recommend having some of this on hand anyway. It works really great for temporarily sticking things down if you're going to run through a router or two pieces together. It can stick them down even more than temporarily if you're not careful though. It has a lot of good bonding power. Okay, so sometimes the trickiest thing with this stuff is getting the paper backing off. We'll see how I do tonight. And being a guy that's old enough to kind of need bifocals but hate them, I'll pull my glasses off to see. There we go. Alright, so I make sure that I bond this smooth side to the tape. And of course that's just so it gets a good bond. If you need to go 2 layers thick, I go smooth side to the tape, and then I smooth this side on the belt sander and put a second layer on. Once this is on, it's on. Okay? There's no fooling around with it. Our next step is pretty obvious. We're just going to shape this foam on the belt sander. But I want to double check my thickness here. And it looks to me like I am very close to the same thickness. I might even be a little thicker than the original. I don't want to go higher than the original if I can help it. I really try to stay pretty true to what the factory created. If you're building for your own gun or if somebody really knows what they want, you can give it a try. Maybe you can do something that's better. But for regular customers, I stick with what they have. I ran across the most wonderful mistake. I realized that my foam was short as my wood. And if we compare these two, we can tell that the foam has to extend out past. Okay? So I had to cut a new piece of foam, which isn't a big deal, but it's something that I had to do before I started shaping. I also trimmed off the edges a little bit on the bandsaw, just to make it easier and less sanding. Here we go. Coming back and comparing frequently to see how the two pieces line up. And they're gonna work. I can tell that it needs to be a little shorter in the back. Let's start the rounding process. Hold on tight to this thing because it'll go shooting right off your sander if you're not careful. So here's the finished piece. Not much difference in shape from the original. A little bit wider across the top maybe. I could shape that some more or I can leave it. I don't think it's going to be a big deal either way. I think the fit of the gun will be fine. Generally at this point I will get the actual gun from someone if I don't already have it so I can test fit it in the stock. And I'll be doing that before I send it out to be covered. I've often thought, could I shoot with it just like this? And I think you could. I don't think you actually would need to cover it if you didn't want to. So this will go to a friend of mine who does leather work. She does a really great job. She does a lot of Western wear stuff and repair on saddlery and things like that. But she uses her scrap pieces of leather to cover soft tops for me. And she does a fabulous job. We have a great business deal worked out. I don't pay her very much, and she does it very quickly. And how can I complain? But this one is going to end up being light blue. I think it's going to be a Tiffany blue. I don't know. I don't think I'll have it back in time before I post this video. But it's an easy process. Don't be scared of it. Whittle away at it a little bit at a time. Sneak up on your final measurements and you'll be fine. If you've got questions or comments, please leave them. I'll try to do my best to answer and respond. Thanks a lot.